The first sound is not a voice. It is a whip snapping through the dusk air, sharp as lightning, cruel as thunder. Its echo rolls across the fields, across the sweat-soaked backs bent low under the setting sun. Then silence heavy, suffocating. Silence broken only by the rasp of breathing and the cicadas shrieking from the trees. Among the figures in the rows, one woman struggles to straighten. Her body is swollen, belly taut with child, yet still she bends, still she picks, still. She labors. The overseer's shadow lingers nearby, hat tilted, eyes watching her every move. He carries the whip not only as punishment, but as reminder. There is no protection, not even for the unborn. She breathes shallow, the air thick with dust and humidity. Her palms stained with blisters, her back aches with the double weight of toil and pregnancy. Each step presses deeper into mud that clings like chains. To stop would mean pain. To falter would invite cruelty. Her womb, instead of shielding her, has become another burden to be exploited, another tally in the ledger of profit. Even her child is counted, though it has not yet taken its first breath. The sun bleeds into the horizon, casting long shadows across the cane. The smell of damp earth mixes with sweat, iron, and smoke from the chimneys of the master's grand house. That house, lit with golden lamps and fine glass, seems another world entirely, though it stands just beyond the fields. Inside its walls, laughter may rise, wine may pour. But here, under the open sky, the only song is the cry of bodies breaking. She looks up for a moment, face streaked with grime, eyes hollow yet burning. Do you imagine what she sees? Not freedom, not safety, only the unyielding rows stretching endlessly forward, as if the land itself conspires to crush her spirit. Still she moves, still she bends, still she endures. But endurance is not survival, it is entrapment. It is the slow theft of a life before it has even been lived. This woman's story is not her own, it belongs to hundreds, to thousands, whose pregnancies were not blessings, but shackles. Each belly swollen beneath the ragged dresses was viewed as promise of labor to come. A cruel arithmetic in which women were not mothers but machines of reproduction. History often hides these truths beneath polished words. But the reality was darker, heavier, more grotesque. To understand, you must step into the silence of that field, feel the weight pressing on her chest, smell the sweat, the soil, the smoke. You must hear the whip crack in the distance and know that it is meant not only for her, but for the child within her. This is where our story begins. A tale not of comfort, but of cruelty cloaked in silence. A tale in which motherhood was twisted into captivity, where the promise of life was reshaped into a weapon. And yet, even in this darkness, a shadow stirs. For silence cannot last forever. Asterisk. The plantation stood like a kingdom unto itself, grand pillars, rising white against the horizon, polished floors gleaming with imported marble, chandeliers dripping with crystal light. To an untrained eye, it seemed a place of refinement, a monument to wealth and permanence. But what is wealth, if not the echo of stolen lives? Every brick, every polished rail, was steeped in the labor of those who would never step across the threshold, except to serve. Beyond the manicured lawns stretched the true heart of the estate, endless rows of cotton and cane, trembling under the brutal sun. The fields were not quiet, they pulsed with sound. The dull thud of hoes breaking soil, the rasp of breath sucked. Between cracked lips, the bark of overseers' commands that sliced through the air like knives. When the wind blew, it carried more than the scent of dust and crop. It carried sorrow, muffled cries, and the metallic tang of blood dried into. The soil, for the enslaved women, even those heavy with child, these fields were prisons. Pregnancy did not grant mercy. Their bodies, swollen and fragile, were still forced to bend, to pick, to carry. If their steps faltered, the whip answered. Can you imagine the terror of knowing each lash did not only cut flesh, but pressed down upon the life inside you? And still, the work never ceased. To the masters, there was no contradiction. A woman's suffering was merely an investment. They spoke of breeding with the same flat tone used for cattle. Children were not sons and daughters. They were future stock, numbers waiting to be added to account books. Slaveholders calculated years in advance, watching wounds as carefully as they watched weather. The cycle was grotesque in its precision. A girl grew into a woman, her body, forced into labor, then forced into bearing children who would continue the same path. Generations chained before their first breath. The quarters where the enslaved slept told another story. Small wooden cabins, cracked and damp, lined the edges of the fields like scars along the earth. The air inside was heavy with smoke from dying fires, damp straw, and the sour stench of exhaustion. At night, women lay on rough pallets, one hand pressed to aching bellies, the other shielding children already born. They whispered prayers in voices so low they barely stirred the air. Not prayers for comfort, those hopes had long been stripped away, but prayers for survival. For one more day, for mercy that rarely came. Meanwhile, the great house glittered with abundance. Silver dishes clattered on long tables. Music floated. From polished instruments, wine spilled into glasses carved from crystal. The women who served at those tables carried within them the same pregnancies that bent their spines in the fields. Yet here, inside these walls, they stood silent, balancing. Trays with trembling arms, enduring the leering eyes of men who saw them as both property and prey. The contrast was unbearable. Laughter behind curtains, silence in the cabins, silk brushing marble floors, rags dragging across dirt. The lives lived in shadow fueled the brilliance displayed in candlelight. And though the master's guests may never have noticed, the walls of the house absorbed everything. The muffled weeping, the muted rage, the quiet groans of women who labored in more ways than one. Slavery was not merely chains and fields, it was architecture, it was diet, it was language, it was the very air. And for pregnant women, it was a net with no escape, a system that stole both their bodies and the futures of their unborn. By the time the sun rose again, nothing changed. The women returned to the fields, their swollen bellies pressing against coarse cloth, their bodies breaking while life inside them stirred. The plantation thrived on that cruel rhythm. The master counted profits. The overseer cracked his whip. The land swallowed their cries, but the quiet did not last. Something darker was beginning to stir beneath the weight of that silence. The night had the weight of a grave. The cicadas that had wailed endlessly through the summer dusk grew quiet, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Beneath the heavy canopy oaks and moss, the air pressed thick and damp against the skin. Inside the slave quarters, eyes shifted to a woman whose silence had always seemed different. She was swollen with pregnancy, her back bent from labor, yet her gaze was steady. While others lowered their heads, hers lingered a moment longer on. The big house across the field, its windows glowing faintly with lamplight. Her name is lost to time, but her act is not. She carried within her not only a child, but a decision. For months she had endured the lash that did not spare her swollen body. The cold calculations of overseers who spoke of her belly as though it were a ledger. She had pressed her hands to the life inside her and wondered, would it be born into chains or into fire? By candlelight, she worked with the precision of someone who knew she would never have another chance. Some say she ground bitter roots into powder, their smell acrid, sharp, impossible to mistake. Others whisper that she collected small vials of poison stolen from the very medicines used to treat the master's sickly wife. Still, others insist it was fire she cradled, fire that licked the edges of her dreams and called to her more fiercely than any prayer. Perhaps it was all of these stories at once, carried by memory like smoke. The house was alive with sound that night silverware clinking against porcelain, muffled laughter over heavy plates of meat, the crackle of firewood snapping in the hearth. She moved like a shadow in the hallways, her bare feet silent against polished floors. The scent of magnolia drifted faintly through the windows, blending with roasting flesh and spilled wine. Her belly slowed her steps, but it did not stop her. The overseer's wife noticed her trembling hands as she poured the glasses. She thought it was fatigue. It was not. The master lifted the cup first. his lips wet with greed before the poison even touched his tongue. For a moment, nothing happened. The room carried on as always idle chatter, the scrape of forks. Then came the coughing. Deep, tearing from the pit of his chest. He clawed at his throat as the wine turned to fire in his belly. The guests froze, forks suspended in midair. His eyes bulged, veins pulsing across his temples as he collapsed against the table, dragging plates to the floor. Shattered porcelain and spilled gravy mingled with the thick stench of vomit. The wife screamed. Her shrill cry echoed down the hallway, colliding with the sound of chairs tumbling over wood. Servants rushed forward but recoiled at the sight. Master writhing, his tongue swollen, eyes glazed with panic thought. Some accounts say his skin turned a sickly blue. Others that foam bubbled at his mouth as he convulsed. He reached out, clawing at the pregnant woman who stood silent, her chest rising and falling, her expression unreadable. But perhaps it was not poison. Perhaps it was fire. Perhaps she struck a flint in the darkness and laid it against oiled. Rags stuffed beneath the wooden beams. Flames crackled at first like a whisper, then roared upward, consuming curtains, portraits, and fine-carved chairs. The smell of smoke thickened, choking, as the fire raced through corridors faster than the screams that followed it. The master's family pounded on locked doors, their shrieks piercing into the night as the blaze devoured the house. Windows shattered outward, raining glass into the yard. Sparks flew skyward, a mockery of stars. The enslaved in the fields lifted their heads as the glow spread across the horizon. Some covered their mouths. Some fell to their knees. Others stared in silence as centuries of silence were broken in one night of flame. Whether by poison or fire, the end was the same. The master's power collapsed in a spectacle of agony. His body twisted, whether by convulsion or by fire, until the land itself seemed to exhale. For the first time, there was no command shouted from the porch, no overseer's bark echoing through the rows, only the sound of crackling timber, or the last gurgling breath of a man who believed himself untouchable. And she, fragile, pregnant, body aching, stood at the center of it. Her vengeance was not triumph, but necessity, carved from desperation. She knew what it meant. She knew the price would be blood, perhaps her own, perhaps the unborn life within. Yet still, she acted. And in that moment, the unbroken cycle of suffering cracked open, if only for a breath. Horror and catharsis bled into one another. The screams of the dying mixed with the sobs of the living. It was a sound that would linger long after the night ended, long after the ashes cooled. For those who witnessed it, the image burned itself into memory, the swollen figure of a woman, face lit by flame or by lamplight, refusing to bow. And when dawn came, when the smoke drifted low across the fields, the land itself felt altered. Crows circled overhead, drawn to what remained. Ash coated the magnolia blossoms, turning them gray, their sweetness choked by soot. The earth groaned. Beneath scorched timbers and trampled dirt, as if swallowing the secret whole. But the quiet did not last. The vengeance of one night could not erase centuries of cruelty. And as the sun broke the horizon, another kind of reckoning began. The morning after was not quiet. The smoke still curled from the ruins, rising in gray columns that smeared the sky. Ash clung to the leaves of magnolia trees, coating them in a dull film. Where laughter and command had once echoed across the fields, there was only the sound of boots heavy, purposeful, unrelenting. The overseers and neighboring planters arrived before the sun fully rose, drawn by rumor and the scent of ruin. They came armed with rifles and raw fury, and the land trembled beneath their judgment. Every enslaved body became a target. Whips cracked like thunder, tearing through backs that had already bent beneath centuries of weight. Pregnant or not, no one was spared. Women were dragged from their cabins, their bellies swollen, their cries drowned out by jeers. Men were chained, beaten until blood pooled in the dirt, until silence was forced upon them by pain. Children huddled in corners, their wide eyes staring at a world set aflame not by fire alone, but by vengeance answering vengeance. And what of the woman? The one who had carried within her both a child and the spark of revolt? Here the story fractures, sliding between history and legend. Some said she was captured within hours, dragged before the smoldering remains of the big house, her swollen body tied to a post. They whispered that her screams rose higher than the cicadas until the whip found silence. Her body, they said, was left hanging, swaying as a warning to all who dared follow. Others swore she was never caught. They spoke of shadows moving through the swamp, of a figure slipping beneath cypress and willow, her breath ragged but steady. In their version, she vanished into the wilderness, carrying her child into freedom, her footprints swallowed by mud and water. Which story is true? Perhaps neither, perhaps both. But what mattered was not her end, but the memory she left behind. The enslaved who survived bore scars deeper than the lash dot their skin, wept red. Their muscles ached, but it was their hearts that carried the heavier burden. They had seen a woman rise against the unbreakable machine of bondage. They had seen power falter, even if only for a night. Yet, instead of deliverance, they faced fresh terror, fresh cruelty, fresh chains. Was the cost too great? Did her act doom them all to suffering? These were questions murmured in the dark, whispered in tones both fearful and reverent. The fields were replanted, the charred beams replaced, but something in the air refused to heal. Overseers barked louder, masters tightened their grip, but the story had already slipped beyond their control. In the quarters, by flickering firelight, the tale of the pregnant woman was passed from lips to ears, from one plantation to another. She became more than flesh, she became symbol. A mother who carried both life and death, who chose defiance when silence seemed safer. Her vengeance did not bring freedom. It brought blood and ash and punishment without measure. Yet even in the weight of sorrow, something lingered. A seed. The knowledge that resistance was possible, that the master's power was not untouchable. And seeds, once planted, are difficult to erase. As the sun dipped below the horizon once more, the swamp cicadas sang again, their cries rising into the heavy night air. Somewhere, in the hearts of the enslaved, her story burned like a hidden ember. An ember small enough to hide in whispers, but strong enough to spread across generations. The aftermath was no victory. It was a haunting. And from that haunting, memory took root. But the quiet did not last. For even silence, when stretched too far, begins to tremble with the promise of what comes next. Her name may be gone, erased by ledgers that counted lives as numbers and by records that chose silence over truth. Her grave, if it exists, lies unmarked, swallowed by soil that has carried centuries of sorrow. Even the fate of her unborn child remains unknown, whether born into bondage, claimed by death, or carried away into freedom. Yet the absence of detail does not erase her. If anything, it sharpens her into legend, a scar carved across history that refuses to fade. Official accounts speak in cold arithmetic, reducing women like her to breeding stock, tallying children, as profit. But against that silence, another record endures. It survives in whispers shared in the slave quarters, in hymns sung low under the cover of night, in stories passed from grandmother to grandchild long after chains were broken. These oral traditions kept alive what ledgers tried to bury, that enslaved mothers were not only victims, but forces of memory, resilience, and, when silence became unbearable, resistance. Their act, whether through fire or poison or the mere dream of defiance, became more than one night's vengeance. It was a reminder that even in the darkest corners of bondage, a heartbeat could still carry both terror and hope. Each unborn child symbolized chains tighten further, but also the possibility that one day those chains might break. Is it not haunting to think that from such brutal soil could grow the seeds of resilience that shaped generations to come? The legacy of enslaved mothers is not written neatly in history books. It lingers instead in the Gothic shadow of the nation itself. In the contradictions of a country built on ideals of freedom while shackled to slavery's cruelty. Their pain became generational, their trauma inherited like blood. Yet so too is their strength. For every child born into bondage, there was also the whisper of survival, the quiet defiance of carrying life when the world sought only to erase it. And so the image endures. A woman in the fields at dusk, belly swollen, sweat clinging to her skin, eyes burning with something stronger than fear. She is both victim and force, fragile and unyielding, silenced yet echoing still. Her story closes not with triumph, but with a question, one that lingers long after the smoke clears and the fields fall silent. If her heartbeat could echo through centuries of silence, can we still hear it now?